Okay, this is gonna be a long one. You've read the title, there's not a whole lot more to explain. Today I'll be ranking each of Gintama's arcs from worst to best. Specifically, the 60 arcs from the main anime itself, a 61st being the Love Potion OVA arc, and a 62nd and 63rd being the second movie, as well as, of course, Gintama the final. But with that being said, some things to consider just before starting. Obviously, comparing Gintama arcs is incredibly difficult, considering just how completely different they all are. So to make it easier, this graphic will be in the top left. The large number indicates my ultimate ranking from last place, my 63rd favourite arc, all the way up to first place, of course being my personal favourite, and meanwhile the smaller number indicates my ranking within that given type of arc. For example, the Tama Quest arc would be my 48th favourite arc overall, but my 26th favourite out of just the comedy arcs. Hopefully that makes sense. I did this because I feel a lot of Gintama videos of this nature tend to segregate the more serious arcs from the comedy arcs. For example, a top 10 arcs in Gintama video may only include the major serious arcs, instead of looking at the show with a more holistic standpoint. Obviously, spoilers, Courtesan of the Nation, Shogun Assassination, etc. is gonna be near the top. But with Gintama being predominantly a comedy, I think it's justified to likewise put comedic arcs up in that top 10 or even top 5 for me. Also, this should go without saying, but we all know how famously respectful YouTube comments are. This ranking is completely subjective. All my personal opinions, especially with an anime so reliant on comedy, I know full well disagreements will inevitably arise. And finally, with the sheer number of arcs in Gintama, obviously don't expect a 5,000 word essay per arc. Most of them, especially some of the comedy ones, I'll only talk about for a few sentences. However, I'll still try my best to elaborate my opinion. So with all that out the way, I think it's about time to get started. Ranking Gintama's anime arcs from worst to best, enjoy the video, and let's begin. In 63rd and last place we have the HDZ4A arc, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, one big parody of obsessive idol culture in Japan. Not a bad idea, but it did not appeal to me at all. I think it's mainly due to the fact that I'm not Japanese. A lot of the jokes parody Japanese pop culture and aforementioned idol culture in East Asia, something I'm not familiar with at all, so I can't blame my dislike on this arc too much. But even still, as with most episodes and arcs centered around Otsu, it wasn't the most interesting arc in the world. It did have some interesting ideas, like how showing idols can't always be perfect, and subsequently the reactions from fans who get that fantasy spoiled. But ultimately, the villain and quote-unquote fight wasn't engaging nor funny to me, due to it simply not being suited to my humour and some jokes going way over my head. If you enjoyed it, then hey, good on ya. Number 62, the Jugem arc. Kyubei is tasked with taking care of the shogunate's pet monkey, leading to one of the more vile arcs in Gintama. This arc was centered around just one single joke, the absurdly long name of the monkey given by our main cast. A joke that grew old straight away in my opinion, despite it being repeated over and over again, each time getting less and less funny. Also, I know Gintama does use its fair share of stupid, immature toilet humour, which I think can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If it's done well, like in the Yaaw arc, it can be stupidly incredible, don't get me wrong, but there is such thing as going too far. And this is a good example. The final scene in the telephone box tries to be funny, but ends up being really disgusting and not a nice viewing experience at all. In fact, in terms of an individual scene, this is probably my least favourite in the entire series. Who does this appeal to? I don't know. Oh, and by the way, these are the only two arcs in Gintama that I genuinely dislike. After this, there was at least something funny or engaging I liked in each arc. Just thought I should make that clear because, believe it or not, I do like Gintama, although they're not all incredible. For example, number 61, the Excalibur arc, an arc about a sentient sword trying to find his wife, because of course it is, this is Gintama after all. This arc has the same problem as the last, the same joke being used over and over and over again until it's not funny at all, but replace the toilet humour with sex jokes, because this is innuendo galore, with all of the jokes about the blade entering the scabbard. Use your imagination. It's funny at first, but the same jokes are beaten so far into the dirt that it naturally becomes stale after not a whole lot of time, and the fight at the end wasn't much better if you ask me. Some of the parodies were good though. When I first watched it, I had just finished reading the Golden Age arc of Berserk, so seeing Gintoki posing as Guts got a good laugh out of me, but even still, This arc is definitely one to forget. Number 60, the Reno arc. This arc is one of a group of mediocre arcs that all suffer from the same problem. It can't make its mind up whether to be serious or comedic, falling somewhere in the middle and therefore not doing either especially well. The premise itself and the abundance of jokes make this arc out to be a comedy, but the main plot itself, especially the ending, make it out to be much more grounded and taken more seriously, and these two opposing tones do not work well together at all. Obviously, comedy can be weaved into more serious arcs, once again case in point the Yaaw arc, but if the comedy starts to dominate the arc a little too much, it completely undermines any more serious undertones the arc may have otherwise had. Also, the parodies didn't work too well with me specifically. I'm not that huge into Star Wars and I've never seen Gundam in my life. Of course that's not the arc's fault, but personally it wasn't for me. Number 59, the Hard-Boiled Detective Arc, an arc ruined by its first episode, without question the most boring episode in the entire series, which is a shame considering the second episode is actually pretty funny. The motorbike scene, the conveyor belt scene, the statue scene, all great gags from the second episode, and if it was just this episode, this arc would not be so low down in the video, but unfortunately, I need to judge the entire thing. Kosunagata is one of the most memorable and one of my favourite minor characters from the entire series, but this first episode does not introduce him well. 70% of it is still images laid upon long strings of dialogue that put you to sleep. The whole hard-boiled joke, like many other arcs down this end, is done to death, repeating over and over again, until predictably it stops being funny. Episode 1, painfully boring. Episode 2, pretty decent. Ultimately, mediocre. Number 58, the Fuyo arc. As I alluded to, this is another arc like the Reno arc, where it's conceptually comedic but also contains some serious undertones and plot points, ultimately leading to neither idea being executed all too well. For example, its ending with Fuyo's sacrifice was not impactful at all, considering we barely just got to meet her, and all of the attempts of a more serious undertone felt a bit flat personally, which I think is fair enough. It was one of the first arcs in the entire series, back when Tadachi was a much less experienced author. Plot-wise, this arc wasn't anything to write home about, a bit forgettable and a little bit bland at times, but at least the jokes were decent. You had the Rocky parody and a sneaky FMA parody that a lot of people forget. Ultimately, not a terrible arc, but by no means one I'd re-watch. As a concept though, it's one of the most Gintama arcs in Gintama, and by that I mean completely insane. An army of android maids attacking the main characters, because why not? Number 57, the Ryugujo arc. Once again, this arc is similar to the Renho and Fuyo arcs, elements of a serious plot weaved in with a conceptually comedic arc, resulting in a bad mix of the two in my opinion. This arc is carried by its first two episodes, with Gintoki and Ko stranded on an abandoned island, making for easily the best parts of the arc, like the scenes on the beach and Gintoki forgetting what anime he's in. It's the epitome of Gintama, dumb, stupid fun, and I love it. Until the main villain Otohime comes into the arc, and that's where it starts to drag on a bit. A pretty bad quote-unquote villain if you ask me, and dare I say one of the worst in the entire series. Unrealistic and weird motivations, a cliche backstory, and just plain annoying. For me, this arc is the opposite of the hard-boiled detective arc. Instead of a bad first half and a good second half, the second half is pretty mediocre, but the first half is absolute gold, so credit where credit's due. Number 56, and here is where the controversy starts. I know a lot of people are going to hate me for this, because I think this arc is way too overrated. It's the character pole arc. As a concept, one of the best and certainly most creative Gintama has to offer. A whole arc centered around the real-life popularity poll of Gintama's cast is genius, and Gintama's the only anime that I think could even attempt an idea as fourth wall breaking as this, and it's fantastic, I love it, but I think this idea would have been better off as just a single episode. For me at least, the whole novelty of them fighting over this popularity poll sort of fades away after a while, and by the third episode it starts to drag on a bit. But don't get me wrong, it certainly did have its funny moments. Case in point, Shinpachi's Fist of the North Star parody, absolutely legendary. But ultimately I found it a little slow and repetitive, not bad by any means, but massively overrated in my humble opinion. I feel like the uniqueness of this arc is definitely what makes it stand out in people's minds more than anything else. Oh, and one final point, the MS Paint opening for one of the episodes was also incredible. Number 55, the Kintaro arc, and I think this is the first arc so far that you could realistically class as a more serious arc, despite not being a major one like Shinsengumi Crisis, Kabukicho 4 Divas, etc. This arc follows the old dying dog known as Kintaro and his relationship with his likewise old dying owner until it's revealed that Kintaro is an Amanto parasite. In fact, this whole arc was apparently a parody of Parasite, which I didn't know at the time. The ending scene of Kintaro and the owner effectively racing each other to the death is surprisingly moving, not at all the direction I thought the arc would go when it began, serving as a pretty dark but satisfying ending to the arc. But with that being said, it's also one of the more forgettable arcs in Gintama, mainly due to, despite it being a predominantly serious arc, the competition it's up against makes it pale in comparison, and ultimately fall into obscurity. Number 54, the Infant Strife arc, the third arc in all of Gintama in which Gintoki becomes a dad for the day, leading to absolute chaos, and it's fantastic, despite it once again being a little on the forgettable side. There's not really a whole lot to say about this arc. Gintoki and Ko find the baby and save Officer, the baby's mother, while climaxing in a battle between Gintoki and Nizo, setting him up for his role in the Benizakura arc. It has its more serious moments here and there, but in the first episode especially, it's just good wholesome fun of Gintoki trying his hand as a responsible parent, with all of the interactions with the rest of the cast as the cherry atop the cake for a pretty solid and inoffensive arc. Nothing incredible, but it's certainly not bad. It's just a little forgettable when comparing it with some of the other more notorious comedy arcs of Gintama, shall we say. Number 53, the Ghost Ryukan arc. Personally, the main issue with this arc is its length. It was an idea stretched out to 4 episodes when realistically it should have been 2 or even a standalone episode if you ask me. But with that being said, there still is a lot of fun to be had here. Of course, the main talking point is it being one massive JoJo parody. Urisawa visit an old haunted ryokan, Gintoki dubs the ghosts as stands, and it just remains that way from then on. We also get some of the best facial expressions in all of Gintama, while we hear Tomokazu Sugita screaming for his life as Gintoki, while the others are possessed and Gintoki is forced to explore the Ryukan alone. Despite being hilarious in places, it did have its problems, as well as the pacing issues. Yaaw was a pretty bare-bones villain, and the fight in the final episode against her and her stand wasn't all that interesting, but ultimately a pretty solid arc. Number 52, the Glasses arc. Sachan has her glasses destroyed and Gintoki has to go and buy her new ones, leading to them fighting assassins along the way in an effort to protect her, because reasons. This was a fun arc, with some great moments no doubt. The cooking scene, and in fact all of the scenes in Zanzo's house were great, but like a lot of these arcs so far, I feel that the second episode started to lose momentum and the ending fight wasn't amazing. Despite that, it did have some surprisingly emotional scenes for Sachan, being one of the few arcs to actually expand on her backstory and character, with her as a central focus, alongside only really the Shogun Assassination arc. I will admit, I did need to rewatch a good chunk of this arc to remember what happened. Ultimately, it was a little bit forgettable, but most of that can be attributed to it being slap bang in the middle of 2 of Gintama's best arcs in my opinion. Number 51, the Mother arc. One of the earliest arcs in Gintama, and despite it not being that high up this list, I definitely feel like it's one of the most underappreciated arcs in Gintama. It's just good plain fun. The stereotypical annoying mum character is comedy gold, forcing her way into Yorozuya and imposing her discipline. I'm sure a lot of people watching this can relate to experiencing this kind of overprotective attitude. If there's any other Indians watching or just Asians in general, I'm sure you understand. This character is literally a carbon copy of my traditional Indian grandma, and I love that. It makes it even more funny when it's somewhat relatable. This arc is also one of the more wholesome arcs in Gintama, with the mother finally finding her son Kyushido, now working at a host bar in Kabukicho, leading for a pretty satisfying and heartwarming ending. Ultimately, this arc is pretty decent, but it does get lost in the crowd when comparing it to some of the other comedy arcs from later on in the series, which is no surprise. Again, it's right at the beginning of Gintama. Number 50, the Homeless arc, reigniting the ship between Katsura and Ikumatsu, a whole 292 episodes since her last appearance, which is crazy. I love how Gintama continues to make even the most minor characters somewhat relevant hundreds of episodes later. This arc is pretty similar to the last one. Instead of a mother reuniting with her son, it's a father reuniting with his daughter. It's heartwarming, it's wholesome, and all that I said about the mother arc can be applied here. Some good clean fun with a bit of emotion for good measure. I think most would agree that Season 6 contains some of the worst comedy arcs in Gintama, such as the aforementioned HDZ48 arc and the Excalibur arc, but I think this is an exception. As is number 49, the Kagura's boyfriend arc, one of the weirder arcs in the series. Kagura becomes friends with a titan, yes, a literal titan, who wants to marry her because this is Gintama and rules do not apply. This arc is carried by the two overprotective dads of Gintoki and Umibozu, and their reactions to Kagura's boyfriend, which was completely stupid but at the same time hilarious. Easily the funniest part of Season 6 if you ask me. The second episode was nowhere near as good, unfortunately, but the first episode alone was funny enough to be this far up the ranking personally, and I say that because a lot of people put this arc right down the bottom, which I don't think is fair. I'm also at the stage now where there's not a whole lot to say about these arcs, especially the comedy ones, because there's not much to critique, but they're also not absolutely outstanding, just plain good. Number 48, the Tama Quest arc. Now I talked about the last arc being weird, but the Tama Quest arc is one of the most bizarre, ridiculous, random arcs in all of Gintama, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we like this show. This arc involves Yorozoya being shrunk by Gengai to a microscopic size, and enter inside Tama to kill a virus within her, only to find themselves in the middle of a Dragon Quest knockoff RPG. In fact, this whole arc is basically a parody of the JRPG genre. Like a lot of these arcs, the main problem is its length, dragged out to 4 episodes, as opposed to 2 or even 1 episode, but regardless, it certainly did have its funny moments, namely Gintoki meeting himself and all the RPG parodies and jokes just in general. The ending, despite being ridiculous, was also pretty climactic, with the ending fight and the fake Gintoki's sacrifice. I wasn't a huge fan of this ending when I first watched it, but watching it a second time, I like it a lot more. Ultimately, a pretty decent arc. Number 47, the Memory Loss arc. Back to where it all began, the first arc of the entire Gintama anime. So obviously, it doesn't hold a candle to some of the other comedy arcs, hundreds of episodes down the line with it being so early on, but it's still pretty decent nonetheless. Gintoki is hit by a car and has amnesia, completely forgetting about Yorozoya and the rest of the cast. In my opinion, one of the best concepts for a comedy arc in the entire series. And resulting in a surprisingly wholesome arc, with Gintoki rediscovering himself and those he knows, while also having some gags sprinkled in here and there. One of the more forgettable arcs for sure. No single scene sticks out in my mind like many of the other comedy arcs, but ultimately, not too bad. I may have boosted it a couple of places just because it was the first arc in the anime, but who cares? Again, another pretty solid arc. Number 46, the Rokaku arc. This arc focuses on a young girl called Kiri, who seeks to avenge her father after allegedly being murdered by Okita during a massacre known as the Rokaku incident, until this claim is eventually disproven. This is definitely one of the more unexpectedly serious arcs in Gintama, especially how it begins with the whole joke of Okita faking his own death, which by the way was hilarious. And unlike a lot of arcs so far, the comedic elements blended pretty nicely with the more serious parts. I feel that the second episode did get a little bit undermined by too much toilet humour for my liking, but regardless, it ended on a high note. The more serious action scenes were all pretty decent as well, particularly the fights between the Joai rebels and Okita. In fact, this is one of the few arcs in Gintama that switches protagonists to someone who's not Gintoki for once, which is good to see from time to time. Nice to get a bit of variety in there occasionally, even if it is just once in a blue moon. Number 45, the Jail arc. This is another comedy arc with not too much to talk about. By no means bad, but not one that stands out. It's just a good arc with a great concept. Gintoki gets sent to jail after insulting its warden. And speaking of which, the warden has a surprisingly touching character arc. Having been writing to the old man while posing as his dead son, it's pretty uncommon to see good villains in these shorter 2-episode comedy arcs, but this is a good exception. But as a whole, this arc was just pure fun. Seeing Gintoki integrate into the jail and eventually escape was incredibly entertaining. Ultimately, a pretty funny arc with some good emotional scenes that blend in just nicely. Number 44, the Guardian Dog arc. Now if I had to name the most forgotten arc in Gintama, This will be it. No one seems to care about this arc, which is a shame because on the other hand, it's definitely one of the most overlooked arcs in Gintama. Yorozai get a job at a Yakuza hideout with the boss claiming that his son has locked himself within the mansion's storehouse for the last 5 years, until it's unveiled that this story was completely fake. Gintoki is then confronted by the son's former bodyguard, Nakamura, who has one of the best character developments for a minor character given his screen time, an elaborated backstory with interesting but clear motivations, and a satisfying end. I don't know why more people don't talk about this arc. Nakamura was a fantastic minor character and antagonist, but again, with this being a predominantly serious arc, the competition it's up against make it easy to see why people forget this one, or maybe they don't, it might just be my perception. Number 43, the Santa arc, the final arc of the original Gintama series. Gintoki and Umibozu compete to see who is the legitimate Santa. These are the comedy arcs I like the most, where there's not a single serious moment to be seen, pure comedy from start to finish. What I've learned is that Gintoki plus Umibozu always equals hilarious. As more and more people turn up as Santa, it just gets better and better, and all the scenarios brought up in the second episode were just as funny. A nice heartwarming way to end off the original Gintama series, with Kakuro's ending message being a nice touch. Definitely the most wholesome arc in Gintama, and a pretty funny one at that. Number 42, the Otsu arc. For me at least, Otsu herself and the episodes about her are definitely some of the most boring parts of Gintama, which is ironic considering the Otsu arc is almost the complete opposite. I know it gets a lot of hate, but for me it has some of the funniest moments in the series. Takutin was legendary, Toshi was legendary, this arc is the epitome of fun. Doesn't take itself seriously at all, but there is one single reason it's not higher up in this video, and that would be its pacing. More so than any other arc in Gintama, the Otsu arc feels long and is long. Way too long. At 7 whole episodes, it makes it without question the longest comedy arc in Gintama. Which is a shame because a lot of the scenes and the individual jokes are fantastic, but when they're spread over such a long time, it can't help but feel slow. Realistically, I think it should have been condensed to maybe about 4 episodes, and even that's pushing it. I mean, some of the most important arcs in the series sit at about 4 to 5 episodes, let alone 7, but anyway, I digress. This arc is absolute comedy gold, just let down a bit by its pacing. Number 41, the Umibozu arc. Arguably the first time in all of Gintama where it got serious. Umibozu makes his debut in an attempt to take Kagura back home, being the first time we get to see a glimpse of her backstory. As with most of the early serious arcs, it feels much more simplistic over some of the larger scale, more thematically and politically complex arcs from later on down the line. The fight against Viamanto on the terminal building was quite a big shock by that point in Gintama, with it being the first time an arc had somewhat high stakes. Even the sight of blood in Gintama was pretty unheard of by this point, which is funny to say looking at it later on. But ultimately, not a bad arc to say the least, with a lot of funny moments added in for good measure. Definitely on the more light-hearted side when it comes to the serious arcs. Oh, and also, quick side note, by going back to old school Gintama to collect footage for this video, it's interesting how you see some gags just completely disappear over time, like the whole Kagura's pickled seaweed obsession. When did that stop being a thing, because I completely forgot. Number 40, the Kaientai arc, some long-awaited Mutsu and Sakamoto backstory, which is always welcome. Up until this point, Mutsu was still a pretty mysterious character, and this was the arc that finally put her in the spotlight. It was interesting finding out her former position as a Harasame pirate involved in slave trading, and the eventual founding of Kaientai at the hands of said slaves, which I found to be a pretty unique and unexpected turn. It also helps that Sakamoto is easily one of the most fun characters in Gintama, and it was about time for him to get his own arc in some way. This man had more screen time in openings than actual episodes. He deserved his own arc way more than any other character personally. The villain of the arc wasn't all that interesting, and there wasn't a huge amount of comedy that appealed to me, but ultimately this arc is here mainly due to the character development and relationship explored between Mutsu and Sakamoto. A pretty good arc to say the least. Number 39, the Frozen Time arc, the first arc of Gintama's 4th series, and much like the aforementioned Santa arc, Otsu arc, etc., this arc is pure unadulterated comedy from start to finish, not a single serious undertone in sight. Ginsuki discovers a clock that stops time, which results in both Gengai and Hasegawa being killed by Piccolo, and Otai getting married to a personified sound effect. Yeah, this is definitely one of the weirder arcs in Gintama. It's just pure fun, parodies galore, most notably Dragon Ball of course, although I do think it did start to lose momentum by the second episode. Some of the scenes with the whole swapping arms were dragged out a little too much for me, but I'm just nitpicking, this was a good arc. Number 38, the OVA Love Potion arc. Okay, so as I've alluded to so far, it's no secret Gintama loves its crude humour, particularly a lot of sex jokes, but my god, this arc takes it to the extreme and, as you might imagine, it's fantastic. Now, a lot of people might not have seen this arc before since it was an OVA released between the Farewell Shinsengumi and Rakuryu Decisive Battle arcs, instead of being standard TV episodes, so let me explain. This arc is set in Yoshiwara and focuses on a special incense which, when inhaled, causes the person to fall in love with the next person they see. Do you sense fanservice? Because I do. Combine it with Tsukio and we're onto a winner. As I said, this arc in particular relies on a lot of sex jokes, like a lot. In fact, it's probably the main reason this arc was an OVA instead of a regular episode aired on TV, but I don't know that for sure. It's just another really fun arc, especially the first episode. Although I do think the arc's main problem is its villain. Nothing inherently bad about her, but I think with how ridiculous this arc is, having some more serious undertones with the villain and her connection with Tsukio felt a little bit superficial in this context. Number 37, the Afro arc. Again, this is gonna be a quick one. Most of these comedy arcs at this stage fall under the category of good, but not rolling on the floor laughing. Just another comedy arc not to be taken seriously at all. Now, any episode or arc with Katsura at the centre is pretty much guaranteed to be hilarious. I'm pretty sure that's something we can all agree on. The inclusion of Katsura is effectively a cheat code for comedy arcs, and this is no different. Katsura sneaks his way into the Shinsengumi as an under-officer of Commander Shimaru, who attempts to socialise with Katsura under advice from Gintoki. I do find it a shame that this arc, nor any that follow it, ever explored Shimaru's character any deeper. Of course he takes centre stage in this arc, but afterwards he's kind of just a background gimmick character. I'm also not a huge fan of his design, obviously in regards to his hair colour. Less so in this comedy arc, but he sticks out like a sore thumb during the likes of the Farewell Shinsengumi arc later on. But anyway, I digress. This is a fantastic arc, the epitome of simple but effective. Number 36, the Patriot Reunion arc. Again, another especially stupid arc, and that's what I live for. Gintoki, Sakamoto, Katsura, and quote-unquote Takasugi celebrate a 10-year reunion of the Jouai War, which somehow becomes a Kuroko no Basket parody because of course it does. Now, to be honest, I've never seen Kuroko's basketball, so I'm sure a lot of jokes went straight over my head, but even still, this was an enjoyable arc. As shown by the Ghost Ryukan arc, Gintoki plus ghosts equals comedy gold, and this is no exception. All of it from Gintoki screaming the Doraemon opening to the flashback scenes of the Jouai 4 make this arc out to be one of the most entertaining, as well as one of the most interesting. It's easy to forget that up until this point, flashbacks were still pretty uncommon to come by. Despite being predominantly a comedy arc, it still served as some valuable backstory on the Jouai 4, and ultimately began the sequence of flashbacks that would lead to their backstory being fully explained by the time of the Shogun Assassination arc. Number 35, the Shinsengumi Death Game arc. One massive Saw parody focusing on Hijikata and Okita. And fun fact, this is the only arc in Gintama where our main trio of Yorozoya are completely absent. None of them make a single appearance. But anyway, this is another nonsensical fun arc. Okita and Hijikata are trapped in a Saw-like death game in which only one of them can survive, and it's the mind games between the two that make this arc so enjoyable. The plot twist at the end, with Okita being in on it the entire time, and the game was his sadistic idea to torment Hijikata from the beginning, was definitely the highlight. Maybe I should have seen it coming, but I didn't, and it was fantastic. It is a shame that at the end, Okita alludes to doing the same thing with Gintoki, but we never got to see it, which was such a massive missed opportunity if you ask me. That would have been amazing, but oh well, it is what it is. Number 34, the Hasegawa prosecution arc. Again, another ridiculous comedy arc, this time focusing on Hasegawa, who gets falsely charged for sexual assault, resulting in him facing a trial in which his ex-wife's new partner is the prosecutor, and of course, Gintoki is the defense. Most likely one big Ace Attorney parody, as Gintoki tries his best to defend Hasegawa. There's not a whole lot to say, it's just another fun arc, not taking itself too seriously like all of the last 5 arcs, ultimately a pretty interesting one. But now we get onto the first of the more major mainstream arcs, with number 33, the Beam Sword Style arc. Coming straight off Courtesan of a Nation, I did not expect to have another serious arc right away, but it was a pleasant surprise nonetheless. This arc focuses on Hajime Obi, a childhood friend of both Otai and Shinpachi, who acts as this arc's antagonist under the alter ego Kenofi, who was implanted with an Amanto device that when activated would effectively declare war on the universe. This arc gets unexpectedly serious incredibly fast. In particular, seeing Gintoki and Shinpachi fighting was heartbreaking to watch, and the ending duel between Shinpachi and Hajime also has a lot of emotional weight behind it. The main spectacle, however, was of course Gintoki vs Hajime. The fight animation was incredible, akin to that of Courtesan of a Nation just gone. But this arc does have its problems, compared with other major arcs. First and foremost, Hajime deserved more character development in my opinion, either by making this arc longer or having him appear before this arc to build his character up and make his death at the end feel a little bit more impactful. And secondly, the Star Wars parody was a little too explicit for me and took me out of the action. If it was a comedy arc, then of course it would be fine, but it's hard to take it seriously when it's so shoved in your face. Basically, I think it undermines the more serious nature of the arc. But nonetheless, this is a fantastic arc by itself. It's just when comparing it with other serious arcs when it starts to fall behind. Less so because this arc is bad and the rest are good, and more so because this arc is good and the rest are incredible. Number 32, the Diviner arc. This arc focuses on Ketsuno Anna and her family, the Ketsuno clan, a group of onmyoji in a long-standing feud with the opposing Shirano clan, and this arc's main antagonist, Shirano Domon. This is probably the hardest arc in all of Gintama to give a definitive type. It could honestly go either way, and unlike a lot of arcs I've talked about so far, I think the two were blended quite nicely together. Serious only when it needed to be, and comedic only when it needed to be. The comedy aspects especially were fantastic. For example, Gintoki's interactions with Ketsuno Anna, Gedamaru's whole character, as well as the Pandemonium-san scene, being quite possibly the most cursed scene in all of Gintama. This arc is yet another good example of a minor character getting a good fleshed out backstory, something you probably wouldn't see in a lot of other anime, and for that alone, this arc is pretty good, and we're only halfway to the top. Number 31, the Soul Switch arc. As with the aforementioned character pole arc, this arc has one of the best concepts for a comedy arc, but whereas that arc, in my opinion, had a good idea but mediocre execution, this arc has a good idea and good execution. Sakata Gintoki as the vice commander of the Shinsengumi and Hijikata Toshiro as the boss of Yorozuya makes for one of the most entertaining ideas in all of Gintama, and the first episode especially is amazing. You have Gintoki transforming the Shinsengumi into a biker gang of bandits, and Hijikata turning Yorozuya into his own version of the Shinsengumi. And fun fact, those bright blue uniforms are the uniforms of the actual real-life Shinsengumi from the 1860s. The more you know. But as with a lot of comedy arcs so far, this arc would be much higher if it was just the first episode, because once again, the second and third episodes let me down slightly. It started to get a little slow in episode 2, and the jokes simply weren't as funny to me as in the first half. Not bad by any means though. For example, the interactions between Otai and Gintoki or Hijikata in each other's bodies was fantastic. Now, I've talked about a lot of arcs so far that are more on the forgettable side, but this is certainly not one of them. Number 30, another completely absurd arc yet again, it's the Feigned Illness arc. The synopsis is in the name. Kagura fakes an illness in order to get back at Gintoki and Shinpachi, until it backfires when they believe she's actually dead and hold a funeral. On a more serious note, it's also quite a wholesome arc, seeing Gintoki and the others genuinely in distress and caring for Kagura while she's believed to be on her deathbed is surprisingly emotional, especially for a comedy arc. But anyway now, the whole spectacle of watching this arc from Kagura's perspective, knowing that she's in reality completely fine, make it entertaining from start to finish, especially in the second episode with her state funeral, with Okuta paying his respects. It's so completely stupid that it becomes great. Like, why is she on a conveyor belt getting boulders thrown at her? I don't know, you don't know, Sorachi probably doesn't know, and that's the beauty of it. Nonsensical comedy is the best comedy. Number 29, the Kabukicho Stray Cat Arc. Gitsuki and Katsura suddenly become cats, don't ask questions, where they meet Hoichi, a former Yakuza member who now lives as a stray cat on the streets of Edo. Unlike, for example, the Renho arc, this arc makes a completely ridiculous, obviously comedic synopsis work well with more serious plot points, mainly in regards to Hoichi, a blend that I said before usually ends in disaster. Hoichi is a pretty fleshed out character all things considered, he has a decent enough backstory, and compared with a lot of other one-off arc characters, he feels much more human, which is ironic considering he's a cat, and on the comedic side, this arc is also tons of fun, especially the interactions between Animal, Ginsuki, Katsura and Kondo, with the likes of Kyubei, Otai, Hijikata, etc. Despite this arc being more on the forgettable side, I think it's quite underrated, there's a lot of fun to be had. Number 28, the Vacation Arc. The first arc so far to include the Shogun, and certainly not the last, for better or for worse. Yorozoya and the Shintengumi with the Shogun take a skiing vacation up into the mountains. And as with most parts of Gintama involving the Shogun, it is quite possibly the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I don't know what Sorachi was smoking when he came up with the human boarding scene, but whatever it is, I'll take 20. This arc is great, and probably one of the most recognisable comedy arcs in Gintama at least. It's one of those arcs that just makes you question why. Why is Gintoki snowboarding down the mountain on the Shogun? Why is the Shogun a bear and why does he get drop-kicked off a cliff? Why does the Shogun T-pose out of existence? Why, what and how? Words you should never use when questioning Gintama's logic. As you can probably tell, I love these immature, completely stupid, nonsensical arcs, as we'll get onto later with some of my favourite comedy arcs, but I digress, this arc is gold. Okay, well then, this next one is probably my most controversial one, so take that into consideration, because I think this is one of the most overrated major arcs in Gintama. Prepare yourself, raise your pitchforks, because it is number 27, the Red Spider Arc. Now, do not get me wrong, this arc is incredible. By this stage in the ranking, over halfway in, all of these arcs are incredible, but not compared to some of the other major arcs, so let me start with what this arc does well. First of all, the art and the aesthetic. The fight scene in particular looked phenomenal, mainly due to its use of light and shadow being in a dark room with only the moonlight shining into it, making for, in my opinion, the best looking scenes of the original Gintama series. The black and white scenes were also a pretty unique feature only used in this arc, and again looked phenomenal. Obviously, I'm not suggesting it should be used all the time, but when used sparingly like this, I think it looks great, and establishes the arc's identity even further. This arc is also fantastic at establishing the interrelationship between Gintoki and Tsukio, presenting them almost as two sides of the same coin, two adults struggling to find a sense of purpose as a result of their troubled past, particularly concerning their respective teachers. But the main problem with this arc would be the villain himself, Tsukio's teacher Jiraiya, mainly due to him falling into the age-old shonen trope of being a completely terrible person, obviously an evil character, until, just as he's about to die, they attempt to humanise him with his entire backstory unveiled all at once in order to make us understand and empathise with him, when in reality, I think it feels a bit forced and superficial. Sure, Hosen in Yoshiwara in Flames is portrayed in a similar way upon his death, but that arc had other standout moments that made it for me, whereas this arc doesn't really have any other key impactful scenes. And I just want to re-emphasise that I do like this arc a lot, believe me, I really do, but it's much easier to talk about negatives than positives. I can assure you, this video will be a whole lot less interesting if I only looked at arcs optimistically. Ultimately, a fantastic arc, but I still know people are going to kill me for this opinion, so with that being said, let me move along swiftly from that into my top 10 favourite comedy arcs, and on top of that, back to the Shogun himself, it's number 26, the Barber arc. Now, as we've established, any comedy arc with the Shogun is weird but wonderful, and this is no exception. You have the Shogun himself, an anti-shogunate terrorist, and the head of the government secret police out to kill said terrorist, all within a couple meters of each other, all getting their haircuts at the same time, with Yorozoya as their barbers. Again, in terms of concepts, this is up there. It's so ridiculously unbelievable having all of these guys here at the same time, to where it just becomes hilarious. Seeing Gintoki interact as the barber in disguise with Katsura, Kondo and the Shogun, fantastic arc. Number 25, the Host Club arc. Yorozoya, the Shinsengumi, and pretty much the entire cast become hosts for the prestigious critic known as Madame Yagami, where they all get absolutely hammered and nothing goes to plan. The second episode in particular is where the money's at. A good 10 minutes are spent roasting the hell out of Vegeta for some reason. I mean, even in another anime, this guy still can't get a W, and as a whole, the jokes and parodies are on point this arc. I would have loved to maybe get a little bit more in depth into Madame Yagami's character, a little more character development perhaps, but ultimately, one of the funniest arcs in Gintama, and I honestly wish, if anything, it was longer than just 2 episodes. Number 24, the Correspondence arc. Shinpachi receives a letter in a bottle swept onto the beach, and starts a sequence of messages to the girl on the other side, with help from Gintoki, Kondo and Hijikata to write back to her. Hijikata coming out as an absolute god of follow-ups, while Kondo and Gintoki give the worst advice possible, and all the innuendos in the first episode are just some of the highlights, with the core narrative also being pretty good as well. Ending with Shinpachi's correspondent, Kirara, being saved from attempted suicide and finally meeting Shinpachi after all their letters. Ultimately, an incredibly fun arc, with a wholesome and especially satisfying ending and overall plot. Also, as a complete side note, it is messed up that the censorship here is as a result of how people in Japan actually get bullied because of their blood type, as it allegedly determines a person's personality, which is insane. I mean, I don't even know my own blood type, let alone other people's. Number 23, the Gintama arc. In my opinion, this is without question the best arc in all of Gintama when it comes to combining serious elements and comedic elements and making them work well together, unlike some of the arcs that blended the two earlier. This ultimately makes this arc pretty unique, one of the more dark and somber arcs, while paradoxically being also one of the funniest at the same time, giving it an interesting quality that I feel few or really any other arcs have replicated. Here we find Yorozoya with a new boss displacing Gintoki, none other than the android himself, Sakata Kintsugi, replacing all accounts of Gintoki's existence, leading to some of the more comedic aspects of the arc. Some of the best facial expressions in all of Gintama, and that's saying something, as well as fourth wall jokes at every possible moment, like Gintoki hitting Kintsugi over the head with the DVD volumes of the anime he's currently in. But as the comedic novelty wears off, a sense of sadness starts to creep in, as we realise that Gintoki is now almost completely alone. All of the people he once considered allies have now turned against him, and it's this sense of dread that I believe is achieved so well. However, my main critique would be of Gintoki himself. As a villain, he wasn't all that compelling, and was more of a gimmick villain than anything else. I think despite being 4 episodes, it could have done with being slightly longer, just to build up Kintoki's character maybe a bit more. But again, another fantastic arc that goes without saying, definitely one of the more emotional arcs, while also implementing good and unexpected comedy parts. Like the whole slice of life parody opening came out of absolutely nowhere, but was welcome to say the least. Number 22, the Dekoboko arc, more commonly known as the gender swap arc, which entails exactly what it says. Unlike a lot of other shonen, when Gintama chooses fanservice, it actually does it well, instead of just slapping in a beach episode. Other anime, take notes. In this arc, we see all of Kabukicho have their genders swapped, because of a religious cult doing something, but that's not important. What is important is the comedy, because it is hilarious, and probably the second most recognisable comedy arc in Gintama, at least in my perception. It's simply just good fun. Definitely one of the more inoffensive arcs that I feel is hard to dislike. It's incredibly entertaining seeing the likes of Kagura, if she was born a JoJo character, and Kyubey finally becoming a man to Otai. Ultimately an especially fun arc. Also, it's worth mentioning that despite showing up for just these couple of episodes, I'm pretty sure Ginkgo has more merchandise, art and cosplay than some characters that have been present since episode 1, which is just funny to me. And now, moving along just 2 episodes later, and we have an arc that I believe gets the most amount of undeserved hate, and that would be number 21, the Shinigami arc. Now, much like the aforementioned Red Spider arc, this arc is most notable for its production quality, especially the art, which is nothing short of incredible. In my opinion, the most beautiful art in all of Gintama, with the obvious exception of the Gintama the Final movie. And on top of that, the soundtrack, which for the most part is unique to this arc, is likewise incredible. A lot of my personal favourite soundtracks from Gintama are just from this arc in particular. To be honest, I don't know why the production quality is this high. I can only speculate it's because this arc is quite short, and there hadn't been another major arc for quite some time, but even still, the production quality here was insane, on another level. The plot itself is also quite interesting. We get to meet the Akita clan, a family of government executioners, including Asaemon, our main deuteragonist, and her brother Yaemon, acting as this arc's main antagonist. Yaemon in particular is a pretty good villain that doesn't get the recognition he deserves. He feels much more natural and human than a lot of other villains that precede him, with his backstory and motivations being unveiled gradually, as opposed to all at once as he's about to die. The same could also be said about Asaemon, particularly regarding her direct involvement in Gintoki's backstory, exploring a part of Gintoki's life that hadn't yet been explained, the time between the Joai War and episode 1. Now, the sole reason this arc isn't higher up is that it's incredibly short, only 3 episodes long, making it hard to get properly invested in these characters, especially considering it was pretty self-contained, in the sense that the likes of Yaemon and Asaemon never show up beforehand or after this arc. Number 20, the Thorny arc. Now we're in the top 20, you can expect most of these arcs to be more serious arcs, with this being no exception. What makes this arc so interesting is its lack of Gintoki, with our protagonist instead being Hijikata and Gintoki being much less significant. This arc focuses mainly on Hijikata and his interactions with Tetsunosuke as his new assistant, resulting in some of the more comedic scenes in the early part of the arc, until we're introduced to some of the most important characters for later on down the line, the Mimiwara Gumi, and by extension Sasaki and Nobume, acting as this arc's main antagonists, directly contrasting against Hijikata and the rest of the Shinsengumi, especially in the latter half during the battle in the construction site. This leads on to the fight scenes themselves, which were fantastic. Hijikata and Sasaki, and especially the fight between Okuta and Nobume, great animation all round, and definitely some of the more underrated fights in the series in my opinion. The second half also has a pretty unique aesthetic to it that makes it stand out that much more. The dark and abrupt colour palette combined with that reddish tint laid on top looks fantastic and helps accentuate the already figuratively dark atmosphere of the arc. The main reason I like this arc over the Shinsengumi arc is because whereas the Shinsengumi arc was much more self-contained, this arc sets the stage for major characters later on, particularly Nobume and Sasaki's character arc, which will be built up all the way to Farewell Shinsengumi. Ultimately, this arc is a bit of a hidden gem that I feel like is forgotten by a lot of people, probably because of the much more major arc not long after it, but even still, it's a shame. This arc has some of the best and definitely some of the most creative action scenes in Gintama. Number 19, the Yagyu arc. Despite being somewhat serious, this arc is much more lighthearted than either of the last two, but even still, I think it deserves a place this high up in the top 20. It's a good example of simple but effective. The best part of this arc is just how random it is. Episodes 76, 77, 78, 80 and 81 are all relatively grounded episodes, despite being somewhat lighthearted. But then, episode 79 is a complete 180. The infamous toilet paper duel was probably the first clip I ever saw in Gintama, and I love it to this day considering just how unexpected it was in relation to the rest of the arc. It's just stupid, immature comedy that has no right to be as funny as it is, but what can you do, it's amazing. But anyway, going back to the plot itself, I feel like in a lot of shonen, Gintama included, the villain is bad, the protagonist tells them to stop being bad, and the villain becomes good. The world would be a much better place if that was actually realistic. But I feel like here, despite it being pretty much the same concept, Kyubey feels much more natural transitioning from antagonist to one of our protagonists. First of all, you can see from the start that she's not a blindly evil villain like some of the others, and her backstory with Otai is also integrated pretty well, making her feel like a much more human villain. And I know I've been saying the same thing for quite a few of these arc-based villains, but what can I say, this is what I believe makes good characterization. Number 18, the Benizakura arc. Now I should preface by saying that I'm counting both the original and the movie remaster as one big amalgamation, since I think there were some elements done better in the anime and some better in the movie. Back to where it all began, back to the first major arc in the series. What makes this arc so significant is how it laid out the groundwork for all of Gintama for the next 250 episodes, until the Shogun Assassination arc laid the groundwork once again from then on. The Benizakura arc is notable for being the first in a lot of ways. It was the first time we saw Gintoki in a truly high stakes and built up fight scene, and it was the first time to truly establish and foreshadow the conflict between Gintoki and Takasugi. The Gintama wiki puts it best, saying, quote, "The Benizakura arc is a major arc for Gintama. It showed that Gintama was not just a nonsensical comedy, it had a story and could show drama and action from this point onwards." But going back to the plot itself, it's an understatement to call it a turning point in Gintama. The relationship between Tetsuko and Tetsuya's eventual death was incredibly impactful, unlike anything in Gintama by that point. The animation was also on point this arc, again setting a benchmark in Gintama by that point, and the final fight scene from the movie adaptation still remains as one of the biggest spectacles of animation in all of Gintama, despite it being so early on in the series. Are other arcs later on more complex and more emotionally impactful? Yes, of course they are, but in terms of significance, this arc is one of, if not the most important arc in Gintama, and that's mainly why it's above some of the other more developed arcs. Number 17, the Confessional arc. A switch in turn back to comedy for this one. In this arc, Gintoki and Tama set up an anonymous confession booth, resulting in the rest of the cast unveiling their true thoughts on the likes of Gintoki. This is another arc notable for its sheer absurdity, of course significantly helped by it being yet another arc involving our beloved Shogun, seeing him lose his memory, resulting in him joining a terrorist organisation that aims to kill him. It's all just simple, outlandish humour. Each of the appointments build onto each other, first Shinpachi, then Kagura, then Sadaharu, and then, because of course, Gintoki is wrongfully convicted for assassinating the Shogun, and then the Shogun joins an organisation who, again, actually does plan to assassinate him. Like a lot of these arcs so far, it's so utterly unbelievable that it just becomes hilarious, and on top of that, this arc is also a goldmine when it comes to facial expressions. This is definitely one of the arcs that I most enjoy rewatching. Completely nonsensical, and a whole lot of fun, what's not to like? Number 16, the Okita Mitsuba arc. At only 2 episodes, you would not expect this arc to be as emotional as it is, but here we are, one of the most unexpectedly serious arcs in Gintama, less so based on action, and more so based on emotion. This arc is based with Sogo at the centre, when his sister, Mitsuba, pays a visit to see him, where she accounts her upcoming marriage, despite her ill health, to her fiancé, later unveiled to be a prominent member of the Joai faction. This arc also serves to solidify the long-standing conflict between Okita and Hijikata, previously a playful gag, now transformed into that of hatred for each other, as we learn the backstories of both Hijikata and Okita, and where this animosity stems from. This arc once again breaks our conventional understanding of Gintama up until this point. Before this, the likes of Okita and Hijikata had never been shown in a serious manner, and their raw emotions came as a complete shock. The shock value alone of this arc is enough to make it stand out, seeing the previously emotionless Okita, now with tears balling down his face upon the death of his sister, is incredibly moving, marking the first time Gintama truly got dark, and by extension solidified Gintama as being capable of being much more gritty and violent than originally expected. I'd say this is the first arc in Gintama that is pretty much unrecognisable from Gintama's usual comedic self, unlike the more light-hearted Benizakura and Yagyu arcs previously. Number 15, the Yoshiwara in Flames arc. As I alluded to earlier, this arc is pretty similar to the Red Spider arc. Both are set in Yoshiwara, both heavily feature Tsukio, and both have villains with similar personality traits and ultimately similar deaths. But there are a couple good reasons why this arc is so much higher up. To start, it came first and was much more innovative, introducing the setting of Yoshiwara, one of the most interesting, unique and recognisable settings in Gintama, while also introducing the aforementioned Tsukio as well as Kamui, a villain built up incredibly well and alluded to since the Umibozu arc, making his appearance here just under 150 episodes later, giving Kagura a nemesis in the backdrop of the already established Gitsuki and Takasugi. The core plot itself is simple but effective. You have Seita, a young boy searching to find his missing mother, Hinua, the top-ranked courtesan of Yoshiwara, held under the thumb of this arc's main antagonist, Hosen. Their eventual reunion turns out to be exceptionally cathartic, helped significantly by how long this arc is, at 8 whole episodes, allowing them to develop new characters to a larger extent than otherwise possible, while also not being too long where it just becomes simply uninteresting. Now, if there's one emotion that I believe underpins Gintama's success, it's shock value, the art of defying expectations, whether in a comedic context to set up a joke, or in a more grounded context. For example, when we occasionally see characters snap. The main example of this would be Gintoki later on, but there is no more shocking scene in all of Gintama than Kagura in her fight against Abuto, one of my favourite scenes in the series, and without question the highlight of this arc, massively overshadowing the actual main fight. It comes completely out of nowhere. This violent snap into her dormant state of pure rage makes for one incredible fight scene, with amazing animation as well, terrifying yet spectacular. Now, the main reason this arc isn't higher up despite all my praise is thanks to this arc's main villain, Hosen, who's definitely one of the worst evil for the sake of being evil villains, which is a shame because it leaves an incredible arc feeling somewhat anticlimactic. More so than any other major villain, Hosen does not feel believable in the slightest. Just this big, strong, evil man that feels like he's there just to fill the place of the arc's villain instead of an actual developed character. Ultimately, he's probably my least favourite of Gintama's major villains. Number 14, Be Forever Yorozora, or the second movie. Much like the Gintama arc, this arc is great in the sense that it's fantastic at blending comedic elements and serious elements together, and most importantly, making the two work well. This is one of those arcs that has it all. Great plot, great comedy, great action, great emotional value, great soundtrack, great animation, and great ending. This arc definitely feels like a shortened down version of the Silver Soul arc before the Silver Soul arc even happened. In this arc, Gintoki is transported to post-apocalyptic Edo, 5 years in the future in which society has been destroyed by the White Plague, forcing those still alive to seek refuge, including our main cast, with the notable exception of Gintoki himself, well, at least his future self. Half of this movie is fairly light-hearted and comedic. We have Gintoki meeting adult Shinpachi and Kagura, making for some of the funniest parts of the movie, as well as Gintoki literally executing Gengai, and Hasegawa taking Gintoki's place in the middle of the Joai War. And then we have the other half, getting a lot more serious, both in terms of Otai's ever-increasing illness, and the plot twist that this arc's main villain was the future version of Gintoki all along. A little bit cliche, not gonna lie, but it still made for a cool unveiling. The finale was also great, with the entire cast fighting in the Joai War, coupled by none other than a song by Duz, and amazing animation, making for one of the most climactic endings to an arc in Gintama, and the use of the first opening in the credits was a nice touch. Number 13, and into my top 5 favourite comedy arcs now, and speaking of arcs with time skips, we've got another one. It's the time skip arc itself, the first arc back after Gintama's 1-year break, following the end of the original Gintama series. Here, Shinpachi discovers that everyone but him has experienced a 2-year time skip, in which our main cast is now completely different. Gintoki is now Yamcha, Kagura is an adult, Kondo is married to Otai, and Okita now reigns supreme over the holy Shinsengumi Empire. This arc is great at subverting your expectations, whether it's by fourth wall jokes, which there are a lot of, or by parodies of other anime. For me, this is one of the funniest arcs in Gintama. It doesn't take itself even the tiniest bit seriously, and in terms of plot, it's all over the place. I love it. It's arguably the most self-aware arc in Gintama as well, poking fun at other shonen for excessively using time skips as a cheap plot device to advance the narrative, and again, it's another one of those arcs that is so utterly unbelievable that there's no need to care about the plot or any of that nonsense when nothing makes sense anyway. It's unpredictable, it's nonsensical, and most importantly, it's hilarious from start to finish. The best honour you can bestow upon a comedy arc. Number 12, the Shinsengumi Crisis Arc. Again, another serious arc from pretty early on in Gintama, and again, yet another arc focusing mainly around Hijikata. This time, he's possessed by a cursed sword that transforms him into a Discord mod. In this arc, the Shinsengumi are under threat from Ito Kamataro, this arc's main villain, with his goal to usurp Kondo's position as head of the Shinsengumi, creating an internal divide within the organisation, those following Kondo and those following Ito. Ito is definitely one of the better villains in Gintama. Sure, he does play into the trope of having his backstory again being unearthed right before his death, a la Hosen and Jiraiya, but even still, his characterization and motivations I find much more interesting than just being evil for the sake of being evil, like how it felt with Hosen. All Ito wanted was a sense of acceptance. He put on a facade of strength to hide his internal loneliness, an unusually humble and even somewhat relatable premise for a shonen villain. But anyway, like most Shinsengumi based arcs, this arc is dark, both literally and figuratively, with some of the highlights including Okita's final lesson, the fight between Gintoki and Bansai, and as a whole, the sheer devotion the Shinsengumi have towards Kondo. The ending duel between Hijikata and Ito also acts as an incredible ending to the arc itself, completing Ito's short but sweet character arc, and ultimately this arc is based much more around character emotion and development than just pure blind action like some other arcs. The comedy was fantastic as well, seeing the manifestation of Hijikata's otaku persona made for some of the funniest scenes of the arc, and somehow made even funnier by the live action version. I don't know how that works, but regardless, this arc is amazing and I probably don't need to tell you that. Number 11, the Rakuyu Decisive Battle Arc. Now this is one of the few arcs alongside the Umibozu arc that focuses mostly around Kagura, giving us significant insight into her and her previously unknown mother's past. The highlight of this arc is obviously the final fight between Kagura, Gintoki, Umibozu, etc. fighting back against Kamui. And much like Gintoki vs Takasugi, this fight not only had strong emotional value behind it, but a lot of build-up, as in hundreds of episodes worth. Ever since the Umibozu arc, we knew this battle was destined to happen, and it paid off. Great animation, unexpectedly brutal, and with heavy emotional weight to back it up, making for a great climax in a great arc. Naturally, being one of our protagonists, finally learning an in-depth backstory for Kagura was incredibly interesting, considering the circumstances around her mother, Koko, had never been cleared up, or even why Kagura went to Earth in the first place. This arc really is an amazing mix of intriguing backstory and engaging action that I simply cannot fault. A lot of people seem to dislike this arc somewhat, but honestly, I can't understand it. At least for the second half, from Takasugi's reintroduction onwards. The first half, on the other hand, is what holds this arc back from being much higher up in the list. Not bad by any means, but pretty slow at times. Especially the fights with the Harasame, with the sole exception of Katsura vs Shokaku, one of the best fights in Gintama. The Katsura Janai Zurada line is quite possibly the coolest thing said by any person ever, and as a whole, because Katsura is normally such a goofy comedic character, seeing him once again in a serious fight scene is everything I could ask for. But to conclude, this arc shines via its action scenes, the emotional weight they carry, and developing character backstory, with the main drawbacks being the slow pacing and largely uninteresting contents of the first half. Number 10, the Silver Soul Arc. Probably the hardest arc in all of Gintama to talk about, because where do I begin? The longest arc in Gintama by far at 28 episodes, split into 12 episodes for part 1, 14 for part 2, and 2 more for the semi-final specials. There is just so much to talk about, but what I like most about this arc is how pretty much every character present from the last couple hundred episodes is significant in some way during this arc. Even the most minor characters, who only showed up once 200 episodes ago, are once again relevant. But obviously, the best individual scene would be the ending fight with Utsuro vs Yorozoya, the Shinsengumi, Kamui, and Umibozu. Once again, great animation, strong emotional value, and incredibly climactic. The golden formula of a great fight scene. But my main problem with this arc is its first half. Much like the Rakuyu arc, but on a far larger scale. It suffered from pretty bad pacing issues, a pretty mediocre and forgettable villain, and personally, the comedy wasn't on top form either for me. If it was just the first half, this arc would be pretty far down the list, so it's a good job the second half is incredible. All of it after the introductions of Takasugi and Utsuro make for some of my favourite parts of Gintama, like the aforementioned fight and the subsequent time skip. And on the topic, the 2-year time skip took me completely off guard, in a good way. It's weird to see a time skip right at the end of a shonen, but I think Gintama made it work well, particularly with Shinpachi's impersonation of Gintoki. Man, that hit hard. The time skip also holds the best comedy scenes of the arc, for example Donald Trump becoming the first Prime Minister of Japan, and on a completely unrelated note, the 2 endings of the Silver Soul arc are also the best in all of Gintama, don't at me. Number 9, the Scandal arc. You were waiting for this arc to come up sooner or later, perhaps the most famous comedy arc in all of Gintama, and for good reason, being another arc based on a completely absurd premise. Here, Gintoki gets drunk on a night out, and reawakens to find that he somehow slept with all of Gintama's female cast at once without his recollection, forcing him to date 6 different people all at once without them finding out about each other. Yeah, this arc is comedy gold, I think we can all stand by that. It's one of those arcs where even when you're not laughing, you have a smile on your face from start to finish, due to just how ridiculous it is, seeing all of these characters literally living side by side with the same man. Once again, it ticks all of the boxes for a comedy arc. Amazing subversion of expectations, amazing facial expressions, amazing premise, it's all just amazing. And the ending with it all being one elaborate prank, although somewhat controversial, I still enjoyed. This is one of the best arcs for out of context clips. For example, Gintoki waking up in bed with Otase, or Gintoki controlling the puppets in the cinema, will never not be funny. Ultimately, I think it's pretty clear this is one of the funniest arcs in all of Gintama, no questions asked. Number 8, the Love Chorus arc, or Chorus arc, I don't know how to pronounce it, but what I do know is this arc is another incredible comedy arc, although I don't see a lot of people agreeing with me on this one, or in fact the 2 remaining comedy arcs. I feel like all this whole video has done is expose just how stupid my sense of humour is, because this arc is also pretty similar to the Scandal arc, in terms of it being completely nonsensical, quite possibly the dumbest thing I've ever seen, and ladies and gentlemen, that's why it's so good. In this arc, Shinpachi gets addicted to a dating sim, forcing Gintoki to join the game himself in order to make Shinpachi snap out of it, resulting in them entering a contest with their hallucinated girlfriends, who in Gintoki's case is a middle-aged woman based on a real-life actor. Yeah, when saying it out loud, this arc is weird. Definitely one of those arcs where if I were to explain it to someone who's never seen Gintama, I could only imagine how confused they'd be, and rightfully so. Number 7, the Kabukicho 4 Divas arc. Finally getting towards some of the heavy hitters. The best of the best, the creme de la creme of Gintama, this arc, like the Benizakura arc, is another arc that redefined Gintama, setting a new benchmark for what we could expect from then on. I alluded to it earlier, but Gintoki's rage scene in the fight against Jirocho, despite being incredibly short, still remains as one of the greatest fight scenes in Gintama, and in my opinion, in terms of visceral, unadulterated emotion, it's right at the top. Much like the Kagoda fight of Yoshiwara in Flames, this fight relies heavily on shock value. It is completely unexpected and takes that to its full advantage, especially by how it subverts shonen expectations as a whole. In a traditional shonen, after the apparent death of Otase, you'd think the protagonist would emerge victorious against her killer as a form of vengeance, but no. Gintoki is likewise left on the verge of death, marking Gintoki's first actual defeat in a fight, an incredibly poignant and bleak moment. This further emphasises that unlike many shonen protagonists, Gintoki is not portrayed as perfect. He loses, and in this instance he loses hard, both physically and emotionally. Despite the fact we learn Otase wasn't actually dead, this scene still hits hard. In fact, this individual frame is my personal favourite in all of Gintama, all of Gintoki's rage bursting out all at once. I could talk all day about this fight scene, great animation, great soundtrack, great climax, but I should probably move on. As a whole, Jujutsu is also a pretty good villain, nowhere close to the same league as Takasugi, Utsuro and Kamui, but as far as one-off arc-based villains go, he's up there, mainly due to his interesting backstory, with his past being interwoven with Otase and her former husband. He's certainly far more complex than the likes of Hosen, Jiraiya and some other arc-based villains, and his development during the course of this arc, from antagonist to more of an anti-hero, is done pretty smoothly. The fight at the end is also amazing, with Gintoki and Jujutsu teaming up to fight the Amantos in certainly one of the bloodiest fights in Gintama, which ultimately leads me to conclude that this arc was incredible at the start, incredible at the end, it was just the middle that let it down slightly. Again, slight pacing issues, the middle was a little dragged out for my liking, and not all that interesting, but ultimately, nothing major, certainly not enough to devalue the start and the end. This arc is unbelievable, no one's denying that. Number 6, the Monkey Hunter arc. Okay, I'm gonna have to explain myself with this one. I can already see the confusion on your face. How on God's green earth do I like this more than this? Well, first of all, as I said at the start, bear in mind how hard it is to compare comedy arcs with more serious arcs, as they are complete polar opposites, but in terms of ultimate enjoyment and willingness to re-watch, I would probably opt for this arc, what can I say? This is definitely not a comedy arc I usually see right at the top, but my god, this arc is hilarious to me, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, because the same things I said about the Scandal and Love Charisse arc could also be applied here. So instead, let me take you through the plot of this arc, because it is undoubtedly the weirdest arc in Gintama, and that's saying something. In this arc, Gintoki is abducted by aliens in yellow latex bodysuits who turn his penis into a screwdriver in order to fix their broken PSPs. This causes Gintoki and Co to join an MMORPG Monster Hunter knockoff to seek revenge, subsequently leading to Gintoki becoming a truck driver before blowing up their UFO. In other words, just a normal day in Gintama. As I said before, the sheer absurdity of this arc, combined with all of the video game parodies in this arc in particular, make it a sight to behold, but in my opinion, only the second best comedy arc in Gintama. The top honour would have to go to Number 5, the Aoi arc. I love Nintendo, I've grown up with Nintendo, and this parody arc of Nintendo had me crying on the floor laughing. I may change my mind of other comedy arcs on this list over time, but I highly doubt I'll change my opinion on this arc being the funniest arc in Gintama anytime soon. Yorozuya, the Shinsengumi, and a man who is absolutely not a terrorist compete in the launch event to win a new Nintendo Aoi, and again, it's ridiculous, especially considering this arc is right before the Shinsengumi Crisis arc, literally this to this in 2 episodes. But anyway, you've probably noticed the common traits in these last few comedy arcs. Absurdist, nonsensical humour that doesn't even attempt to take itself seriously in the slightest. And for that reason, I of course love it. I'm ashamed to admit, it's the simple things that make me laugh, like Hichikata stubbing his toe and literally dying as a result. Does not have any right to be funny, but I was in hysterics during some of these scenes. Comedy at its peak. I love this arc. Obviously, this arc had loads of video game parodies that made it that much better, especially the Dragon Quest parody in the second half. filled from start to finish with jokes. If you couldn't tell, I really loved this arc, easily the funniest in Gintama for me. Number 4, Gintama the Final. Now, having already made a full video on this, I'll keep this incredibly quick since there's not a whole lot more to add. I'm also forced to view it with quite a different perspective than any other arc due to the nature of it being an ending movie. Basically because of the fact that regardless, I'm gonna like it because of it simply being the ending to an anime I love, and the fact that it's hard to rank on its own since you could argue that it's just a continuation of the Silver Soul arc. What I'm saying is, these things probably warp our perceptions of this movie somewhat, so it's really hard to rank on its own, but regardless, you probably know that I adore this movie from my old video, so I'm not gonna repeat myself. This video is long enough as it is, it's a near perfect movie. Number 3, the Courtesan of a Nation arc. This arc had it all, the comedy, the action, the emotions, the animation, the soundtrack, the lot. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. It's another monumental arc in Gintama's lineage. This arc follows a somewhat simple concept, reuniting the courtesan of Yoshiwara known as Suzerain with her beloved Maizo, a servant of the shogun that had been split apart from her. A pretty simple synopsis, right? Well, who could have guessed that this will culminate into a large-scale political drama in which our protagonists are enemies of the state awaiting execution. This arc is once again another benchmark arc. The stakes have never been higher up until this point. Much like in Kabukicho 4 Divas, the highlight of this arc would be Gintoki's raw, unadulterated rage breaking out once again in the fight against Oboro, this time made even better by the fact that it's intertwined with some new information on Gintoki's backstory. Here, after 250 episodes, we finally get to see more than just a mere glimpse into Gintoki's past. It's the first time we learn of the death of Yoshida Shoyo and the impact it had on Gintoki's life, finally elaborating on how Gintoki became the man he is today. But anyway, it definitely helps that Oboro is a fantastic villain, definitely fourth in line behind the big ones, with it being made even better with the benefit of hindsight, having learned about his own backstory in the Rakyu Decisive Battle arc. Here, Gintoki and Oboro are depicted like two sides of the same coin, both students of Shoyo, outcasts of society left without a sense of purpose, and forced to suffer as a result. Much the same as the relationship between Gintoki and Takasugi, and also Gintoki and Tsukio as mentioned earlier. This arc has some of the most spectacular and creative fight scenes in Gintama that stand out significantly from the rest, particularly round 1 and 2 of Gintoki vs Oboro. Some of the scenes, like Gintoki biting Oboro's sword in half and him emerging to attack from behind the dead body, will forever stick in my mind. This feels like the first large-scale arc, in terms of the sheer amount of factions at play at once. You have Yorozoya, the Shinsengumi, the Mimawaragumi, Naraku, Shigeshige and his men. There's just something so grand and cinematic about it that truly makes it a spectacle to witness. Number 2, the Shogun Assassination arc. Okay, so you don't need to be a fortune teller to have seen these two arcs taking the top spots. Realistically, they both deserve entire videos to themselves, and for good reason. 400 words cannot do these arcs justice. But anyway now, take the highlights of all of the major arcs so far, times them by 10, mix them all together, and you have the Shogun Assassination arc. You want the darkness and despair of Kabukicho 4 Divas? We have that, but more. You want deep character explorations with detailed backstories like in the Courtesan of a Nation arc? We have that, but more. You want a fight that's been built with hundreds of episodes of emotional weight behind it, like in the Rakyu arc? We have that, but even better. You want beautiful animation with stunning scenery and detailed artwork, like the Shinigami and Red Spider arcs? We have it, but even better. You want an incredible villain, more interesting and complex than all of Sword Art Online. Well, do I have the man for you. But in all seriousness, what is there more to say? Most would argue episode 305 is the best single episode in Gintama, a statement I'd be inclined to agree with, and some would even argue it's the best episode in all of anime. A strong statement, but a completely fair assessment. The fight against Takasugi is legendary. As alluded to, the build-up of this fight is insane. We first learn of Takasugi in episode 17, with it all being led to this moment, and my god did it not disappoint. On top of the incredible animation and spectacle in the fight scene itself, the emotional weight behind it is even more impactful, helped by how Gintoki and Takasugi's backstory is cleverly weaved in and out of the fight without getting in the way. So far, Gintoki's backstory had gone from tiny amounts of information early on in Gintama, some larger notable details unveiled at about halfway, major factors that shaped his life by about quarter-ton of a nation, and finally, a full explanation, unveiling all that we could ask for in Shogun Assassination. The key takeaway about this arc is not just its incredible execution, but the amount of build-up that makes up its foundation. If this arc happened in, say, episode 50, it would be considerably worse in my opinion, due to it not having a strong quote-unquote foundation. We also must talk about this arc's namesake, the assassination of the Shogun, Tokugawa Shigeshige. In a shonen like Gintama, where hardly any major characters die, this hit hard, arguably the most major part of Gintama's entire narrative. It's a catalyst for what's to come, setting the tone from then on of what was 8 parts comedy to 2 parts serious to the complete opposite, most explicit in this arc's immediate aftermath, of course being, number 1, the Farewell Shinsengumi arc. I'm gonna keep this short as to not repeat myself, because all that I said about the Shogun Assassination arc can likewise be applied here. Take the best parts of all of the major arcs and combine them into one. The main reason this arc has a one-up over the Shogun Assassination arc for me is its tone, especially near the beginning. In the Shogun Assassination arc, as dark and gut-wrenching as it was, there still was a lot of energy. It was, to put it lightly, a spectacle. Whereas here, following the death of the Shogun, the whole ambience of Gintama does a complete 180. We see Gintoki, usually the centre of attention, bringing a sense of charisma wherever he goes, but here it could not be further from the truth. What we see is a broken man, plagued by the death of the Shogun, a man he tried so hard to protect but failed, and nothing he does will undo that. He is completely and utterly shattered, an incredible juxtaposition to the Gintoki we see virtually any other time in the series. When a character dies in another anime, even ones I love like Attack on Titan, it feels like their deaths never have a long-lasting impact. Sure, they'll be mourned for 1 or 2 episodes after they've died, but never have a lasting impact on the overall tone. But here, the lingering bleakness never seems to truly go away throughout the entirety of the Farewell Shinsengumi arc. It would have been easy for Sorachi to downscale the death of the Shogun, but he doesn't, and I love that. Personally, I like to combine the Shogun Assassination arc and Farewell Shinsengumi arcs into one, since they're both incredible. They are, dare I say, the best arcs in anime, in my personal opinion, and definitely require an independent video of their own. Not foreshadowing whatsoever. But apart from that, I know it's a bit of an anticlimax to end this way, but as I said, all that I said regarding the Shogun Assassination arc can be applied here. The fights, especially against Utaro, the emotional weight, the animation, the art, the soundtrack, all absolutely perfect. The death of Sasaki at the end, as well as his entire character arc, was also incredibly emotional, and helped to humanise Nobume a lot more, seeing a character who was almost completely stoic and devoid of emotion, now weeping tears of sadness, made her feel much more believable. Basically, to conclude, these 2 arcs are obviously the pièce de résistance of Gintama. No one's debating that. The only reason I like Farewell Shinsengumi more is due to its distinguished tone. The bleak and somber atmosphere is unlike anything else I felt in really any other anime. So, with that being said, we finally reach the end, and I'm already dreading how long this is gonna take to edit. I started making this video on October the 31st, so God knows how long this is gonna take to upload. Probably by about Christmas time, so happy holidays. And if it's a bit later, then happy New Year's. But with that being said, I do want to emphasise again that this video was completely subjective, my own personal taste, especially with the comedy arcs. I know you will probably disagree with me. Just be civil in the comments, please. Also, with the nature of this list, it's incredibly volatile. A lot of arcs in the middle I'll probably change my mind over time, but what I can say for definite, the Farewell Shinsengumi arc is my favourite arc in anime, and the Aoi arc is my favourite comedy arc in Gintama. And I think that's a good place to end on. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year's, here's to 2022, and I'll be back in the next video. See ya!